Hi, welcome Hannah to What the Force and celebrating Willow.
Oh, oh, I'm excited.
Thanks for joining me on the show. I'm really excited to talk about Willow and the Cthulhu Mythos elements. This has been something that I have been wrestling with in my subconscious since the start of the show, and John did that tweet post episode 1 and 2, and
Uh-huh.
I didn't know what to do with myself for weeks. Yeah, and people might know you actually from like Willow Twitter. You've been
Yeah,
doing these epic tweet threads explaining different aspects of
thank
the
you.
show, stuff that like Missy and I have gone into, but then you back it up with all of the receipts, which I appreciate because then I don't have to do it. And you've also been a super active participant on our Willow channel on the What the Force Discord, which is so fun that you've been so engaged. So thank you for your contributions to the Willow fandom. I think it's just adding to the fun and to the enjoyment and the exploration of these different themes. You know, how these things are inspirational. It's so like,
Mhm.
I hate to call back to Star Wars, but this is a Star Wars podcast, but it's very George Lucas to have these deep inspirational things that have
It is.
inspired John, and now are showing up here as something that is deep and meaningful for the story.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's one of the things that I think got me to want to like read even more about this and make threads about it was because I would like he made it so clear that like this rabbit hole goes deep. So
All right, so let's dig into H.P. Lovecraft and sort of what he represents from a story perspective, why he's so interesting when you start to dig into him a little bit more in relation to the story of
yeah,
Willow.
I think I want to start with just reading this quote by H.P. Lovecraft, which actually is really interesting because it's written in Nakotic in episode 8, I believe, at the storybook intro. So, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is the fear of the unknown. And this quote comes from the Supernatural Horror in Literature, which is an essay he wrote, which basically goes into why horror is a legitimate genre in literature that should be taken, seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just sort of like a pulpy, it's a genuine thing that's important. And this whole mythos that it's called now is um, kind of a genre built around his works, but they were expanded on by other authors. And it's horror, but it's often mistaken as being nihilistic and can often be identified as existential. But Lovecraft didn't actually consider himself a pessimist or an optimist, but something he would call a cosmic indifferentist. So essentially, uh, the belief that we were like sort of insignificant in the greater uh, perspective
Mm.
of the cosmos and everything that it encapsulates. And this is actually touched on in the show in the form of a joke in episode 7, when Zeb, the sleigh
Yeah.
fisherman guy, he talks about how they were all existing in the dreams of a god, and that's a reference to Azathoth. And he's essentially a god that is asleep, and the entire universe exists in his dreams. And the moment he wakes up, it'll all disappear. And so he plays it off as this like, so nothing matters,
Some
and
people look
it's a joke.
some people look through the Webb telescope to feel insignificance, and all you could do is just go pick up a H.P. Lovecraft book.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, that's all you need. And like I said, it kind of it involved like all of these different authors coming together to
Mm-hmm.
expand on his work, which was something that he really encouraged. And he himself even took things from other authors and they like swapped ideas, and he would take from works that came before him, which we'll get into a lot more detail later when we talk about Haster specifically. But what's interesting is the Cthulhu Mythos was actually dubbed that by August Derleth, one of the other authors that you'll frequently find when you delve into the world of Lovecraft.
And so there's almost like this iterative and community-based storytelling. I believe
Definitely.
John, in one of the interviews, actually kind of talked about it like an RPG and D&D in
Exactly.
that way. Like it's a shared storytelling playground, which
Mm-hmm.
to me feels like modern day fan fiction in some
Yeah,
ways,
essentially.
and what has developed as fan fiction writers having sort of a shared language that they end up using if they're kind of communicating about a specific type of property. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just so dope and cool. And I love it so much. You know,
Exactly. And I think, oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, and I just want to like point out like this is the tweet that John actually referred to talking about Cthulhu Mythos being used, and also in an interview he confirmed that it's not just a small amount, but also a large. It's not little; it's deep, and we're gonna go into like the smallest piece of the pie to do with it because uh like John said, be careful, enter at your own peril because it leads to ancient places. And quite literally, it could go like it goes on and on and on. And you and I have
Oh my
had like
goodness.
direct message, DM conversations about this. You're like, and this page of text, and I'm like, Hannah, like I can't right now. It's so much.
I
And
just like I think it was the first time when I figured out one specific connection, and then I just messaged you like wall of text and then just like screenshots of entire pages. And I'm like, so this means
and like and I want to just like my caveat is this is all inspirational and it's giving John a good place to play and a playground in which to play, but do I think that it will mean one to one that it's actually Cthulhu? No. I think it'll be
no.
the thematic elements of
Mhm.
what it represents and how that represents itself within a very psychological journey, because
Mhm.
as more and more interviews come out from John, we know he thinks about these things in this way.
100%. And I think
Yeah.
the best way that to kind of like picture that is in the way that John talks about it when he mentions like stuff like It by Stephen King and The Neverending Story
Mm-hmm.
were really influential in kind of the way that he was crafting this story, and the way that he was handling those themes. Because at the end of that, at the end of exploring all of these conceptual ideas, it always came back to love being the answer. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's really important.
Yeah, and that's incredibly Campbellian, I want to say. Like, in some ways, you almost have to go into the unknown and into desolation and be broken down to understand that we're all interconnected and you can only understand your place in the universe through loving others. It's really,
Mm-hmm.
really interesting that we're getting this fairy tale and mythos connection
It is.
like
And
you've
I think
called out
he,
on Twitter so many
oh,
times.
so many times, so many times. And I think the one thing that looking back really sticks with me that I think they nailed so much is how that fear of the unknown is handled in Kit versus Eric. And the way that,
Uh,
because they both bring up fear, like when Eric says, when I let go of my fear when he's walking into the temple with them, and then when Kit says before they're about to jump that she didn't give her fear the power, but she gave it that power to Alora. I think that it perfectly for me summarizes like how he's handling these themes and how he's nailing it.
Let's go into Haster the Unspeakable and the King in Yellow.
Yes.
Let's dive straight in.
Okay, so really brief summary. What you'll find often when it comes to Lovecraft and all of the works, whether it's directly from him or a different author, there's the great old ones, the outer gods, and occasionally the elder gods. And Haster is what would be a great old one. And so it's interesting because, especially because John included this character as a reference. How do I phrase this? He chose Haster of all of the mythos specifically for Grayden, who is a main character and a majorly important one. And I find that so fascinating because Haster is actually such a small, minute part of Lovecraft, but specifically his work, because he only actually uses Haster once in any of his own writing, and Haster is expanded on by other authors. And I think that's really interesting. Okay. So where Haster originally comes from is a couple of short stories by Ambrose Bierce, who was a large influence for H.P. Lovecraft. So that would be Heta the Shepherd and an inhabitant of Carcosa. And essentially that's where we learn of Haster, who is a god of shepherds. So the shepherds worship him, and he's essentially a benevolent god. And then in the other short story, we learn about Carcosa, which is this city of the undead, essentially. But that's the only works that Ambrose Bierce used these characters or these places in, and it was expanded by Robert W. Chambers in a short story anthology called The King in Yellow. And this is where really most of Lovecraft's inspiration came from, because this is a horror anthology. So it's basically all of the short stories revolve around a play called The King in Yellow. And we only get small fragments of it. We never get the whole play. And what they keep saying is that if you read past the second act, like if you read past that point, then you can't just put it aside. You have to finish it. And once you do, you essentially become like bound to it. Like some go insane. It's that like this unknown thing that drives people to insanity that you see so much in this kind of genre. But there's little bits of pieces in context that we get from the excerpts that are in the short stories. So Haster, Carcosa, the Pallid Mask, the Yellow Sign. That's another big one.
What is the Yellow Sign? Is that it's the one that's on the slide right now, which is kind of this like kind of question marky one, and and it looks very similar to what was used for the Order of the Worm as a symbol.
It does, and
it's just missing one little branchy.
It is, and I think that's something that's really cleverly done, because they saw this symbol that existed in the original movie, and then knowing that he wanted to do Haster and like the King in Yellow as like a point of reference, like taking that and expanding it and specifically making it yellow. I mean, it's like you can't think that it's not clearly like meant to be the Yellow Sign. Like that's what that is. So
how does this relate to, I guess, Grayden? Like how do we take what we know from all of these stories and distill it down to what sort of things that
Mhm.
they might be pulling from. Because you said Haster was potentially a benevolent god.
Yes, this is the thing that I find really interesting because in that original piece, the character just is always thanking the god Haster for thank you for having my people be next to this specific mountain in this place and for protecting my sheep
Mm-hmm.
and all of these things. And then in The King in Yellow, essentially, like Haster is the King in Yellow.
Mm.
And so there's this city and it has a royal family, but there's a curse on the city, and there will not be another king until the coming of the King in Yellow. And that's this prophecy that's very consistent. And it's kind of unclear, depends who's writing it, but sometimes this is a prophecy of like, oh, we can't wait for the king to come, and that's going to be a triumphant thing for us, or that is spelling our doom. And in particular, there's a line from the first, at the end of it, the first short story, Repair of Reputations. At the end of it, it says, you have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the King in Yellow. And what happens there is the main character who believes that he is descended from the dynasty of this city and is the heir to Haster. So it's this weird thing of like, he will come, but he's probably going to come in the form of like an heir.
Right.
And
What do we have?
and
We have a king,
king,
potential, and a
basically.
prince. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um,
Hmm.
hmm. And there's a couple instances in which we see um, essentially like a failure to assume that role of
Hmm.
being the heir of the king and Haster. So like this character, it did not work out for him. And then there's an excerpt later that I'll talk about that includes another instance of that. Um, let's see. Oh, and then in terms of just like the yellow sign itself, that's something that is included in The Whisperer in Darkness, which is the only short story in which Lovecraft talks about Haster. And essentially, the context there is that um, the main monsters or supernatural beings the characters are involved with are the Migo, also known as the fungi of Yuggoth,
Wait,
which
what?
is, yeah, oh yeah.
You mean the spell that Alora cast to call upon dark powers that blasted Willow and hurt
Mm-hmm.
him? What?
Yeah. And this is what I'm a little interested in because in this short story, it's established that the fungi of Yuggoth are enemies to the followers of Haster and the followers of the Yellow
Mm.
Sign. So in terms of like the crone suggesting that spell to Alora,
Mm.
I don't know. That's something I've been thinking about, like where, like regardless of like if this all comes back to the worm or not, Grayden, I think, our Haster in this is adjacent in some way from the dark power that we've seen in this show or in this first season with the crone.
Mm.
Like it to me, it establishes that they're on opposite sides.
So
Like
there's like
Grayden,
a third party, maybe?
yeah, and what's interesting is that uh, when Robert, or not Robert, August Derleth did his own story called The Return of Haster, which is funny because this is when he suggested that the entire mythos be called The Mythology of Haster. But then H.P. Lovecraft was like, no, but he's just like a small part of it. And then Derleth came up with the Cthulhu Mythos. But when he was writing The Return of Haster, one thing that he was trying to set up was the idea that Haster is at war with Cthulhu.
Mm.
And so there seems to be consistently this idea of like a separation in general and war. And that gets even more consistent with when we get into Lynn Carter, because that's a big part of all of his writing on
It's
the
like
subject of Haster.
he's sort of like against Cthulhu in his own
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and I think it's interesting because that would sort of in a way trace back all the way um, to Ambrose Bierce and Haster being a benevolent god.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it really interesting. And I think this potentially could be why John shows, of all of the Lovecraft characters that he could possibly do this with, that he chose Haster because, yeah. So in particular, I think most of what John has drawn from is the work of Lynn Carter. And it's interesting because most of his stuff is fragments,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like the best of pretty much the entire Haster cycle in terms of melding the original works and the Lovecraft world together. So his stuff includes a sonnet called the Litany of Haster, um, a kind of like an outline for a short story called The Carcosa Story of Holly, and then a revision of a different author's full play of the King in Yellow. Um, and so let's see. Do you want to talk about the candidate part first? And because I think that's pretty relevant to, I think, Eric as a character. Um, so the whole sonnet is very good, but I'm just going to read this end section called "The Candidate."
Sure.
Um, down the dark street. Sure, I'll start. Um, Down the dark streets of monoliths I passed, the shambling, faceless figures of my guide, a voiceless thing that beckoned at my side. And to the dreaded gate I came at last. Before the silent guardian I made the black unhallowed sacrifice, and spoke names. At those sound unforgotten echoes woke. The portals gaped. I entered unafraid. Fate, or my stars, or some accursed pride, had brought me here. Naked I stood alone, and took the vow before the elder throne. He laughed and drew his tattered mantle wide. Oh, do not seek to learn, nor ever ask what horror hides behind the pallid mask. And to me, that felt like very much Eric. What happens to Eric? He's in this city with monoliths, and he has this guide, and he's making this sacrifice and this vow.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, that doesn't exactly work out for Eric, and that reminded me, in a more hopeful way, it doesn't work out for him.
Yeah.
For the characters in here that it doesn't work out for them, it doesn't work out for them in a very bad way.
In death?
But essentially, like,
Like, do they die? Do they go
I'm not
crazy?
sure what happens to this guy. I'm not sure what happens to the person in the candidate. This is the last section of it, so
Okay.
possibly. But for the guy in the repair of reputations, he offs his cousin and then gets arrested
Okay.
because he was trying to. Yeah, it's a whole thing. But for Eric, essentially, and I think this is something that, because the play itself is so brief, um, it's unclear exactly, and it's just hinted at, and you can make of it what you will. But the the person with a pallid mask is often associated with either essentially a harbinger for the King in Yellow, or the King in Yellow himself, and the royal heirs that we see in the repair of reputations, um, like they're making a claim to this dynasty, that they are the royal servants of Haster, and they're going to be rewarded by him. And I think that's very similar to like the Blood of the Six and what Eric is
Mm.
being promised to be king, but then their attempts fail. And then I think that's going to be different with Grayden,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like stepping actually into that power. But it's not going to be but because Grayden is Haster, he's Grayden Haster, he's not going to be subservient to some other thing.
Right. Because he himself is like sort of foretold to come and do all of these things. Oh, that's so much cooler than him being a worm.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, and because in Lynn Carter's the Carcosa story of Holly, that's where the immemorial city comes from. Often the city in these stories is called Carcosa, but in this case, it's the planet's called Carcosa, and the city is called just the immemorial city, and it's undead, and it's infested with liches. The word lich is actually used and described in detail.
And it is a city of undead because Borman called it an undead city.
A city, yeah. Exactly. And necromancy is mentioned and brought up a lot in the story. And then this is also where we learn that, as you like to call her, Shubsy, is the I can't remember her other titles. Black Goat of the Forest or something.
Yeah.
Something she's with 1,000 young.
Yeah, she's like got like a million hooves and stuff like that. She's weird.
Yeah. She's weird. But she is the mate of Haster, or they've mated and had offspring that are other gods within the mythos. And in particular, he's like Haster himself is trapped beneath a lake, and he was like actually like sent down and trapped there by adversaries, and he was trapped there, but now he's just waiting and biding his time, and that's when the coming of the King in Yellow is going to happen. And so I guess this would be like, what do you think?
I mean, lakes in general are a subconscious symbol, right? So being at the bottom of a lake is the King in Yellow is trapped in his subconscious.
Oh man, that's crazy. Because like considering everything that Grayden's been through.
Yeah. Like he is that thing, whatever that thing is. Yeah. Huh.
And I guess this is a way we could directly go into some speculation.
All right. You want to?
If you're ready.
All right. Let's go. Speculation time.
Okay. I brought it up a little bit, but so the harbinger of the worm. I think personally that's the heir to the King in Yellow is essentially what that is, I think. But in the same vague way of like that's also literally the King in Yellow. So like that's why Eric would have become king,
right?
When and what I'm interested in, because you and Missy have been mentioning like on Twitter a bit that it's possible that we could see Grayden have like a mask or a kind of armor.
Yeah. that's just like
me think of pallid mask.
Yeah, like so that's from Lost Husband and Adjacent Animal Husband folklore and fairy tales, which is that when you are doing that symbolically, there is a skin, an animal skin that is in the way. I also think that this ties to Isis and Osiris and how Osiris was trapped in a coffin, and sort of ties to Vader and Kylo from a Star Wars perspective in that they are masked, so they are not able to show their true self. Masks are meant to be revealed, right? Masks are meant to be taken off, all of that, right? But the armor or cloak, maybe. I could even see a cloak since Grayden's not really like an armor guy, but a mask and a cloak could be quite dope. But you know, there is something, right? And I find it fascinating that even from early stages in the episodes, Grayden is wearing animal skins quite like
Mm-hmm.
fuzzy outfits. Like he is kind of already projecting some of that. Yeah. Missy could go on and on about how Grayden has represented a revenant, demon lover, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And but so has the crones, so has Eric. So all of these things are together.
The one that I think is interesting about the Pallid Mask specifically is because it's the concept of that is centered around like a big reveal. Like when, because the character is requested in the story to remove his mask, and he's like, "I'm wearing no mask," and they're like, "What?" And it's like an excerpt that's like hinting at this like shocking thing. But I think for Grayden, what could be an interesting similarity to that, if not a direct reference to it, would be like just simply revealing like this elusive character that we don't know who they are. They're just wearing a mask and a cloak or whatever, and then big reveal, it's Grayden, who we thought was dead this whole time. What?
Mm-hmm.
Or Grayden having this darker persona, and then everyone being like, "No, this isn't Grayden. This isn't you." And then like he explains to them, "No, it's I am this thing." It depends on the execution, but
Yeah, I also think that there might be a chance that him being reborn in the Wormland without scars was him taking off his
oh,
baby Graydon mask.
I've just so much mass possibility for sure. And we've talked a little bit about Grayden literally being the worm or the heir to uh, the King in Yellow, or how that's going to work. And I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on like what the worm is in terms of, is he going to be like do you think, because I've looked at it both ways, like is the worm the original King in Yellow and Grayden's just the heir to the King in Yellow, or is the worm something completely different and Grayden's going to usurp him?
Um oh god, I go back and forth so much because of the iconography that we see in the show. Like there's an Oberos, and but it's not actually connected, so it's not actually a
Mm-hmm.
life cycle like you would hope to see. It means that there's an end to times and there's no chance for rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
Willow prophecy tends to function on a level of telling the truth even though you don't
Yeah.
understand it. And so like there's this idea that Dark Allura has put out there that's like, you will sit with me at the head of all tables and help me bring my light to the world or whatever. And that could
Mm-hmm.
like friggin' entirely be true. And we end up having kind of like a loving, benevolent death god and a loving, benevolent sort of light god and goddess.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then there ends up being kind of a cycle to the universe. Um, I there the worm is something wrong and off kilter
Mm-hmm.
about
Mm-hmm.
Anduin. That we certainly have been presented. It doesn't. It seems to be disconnected because it is craving a. It's disconnected from whatever Alora is doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she's independent of whatever it is doing. And
Yeah.
um, there is an aspect of, how do I put this? Um, like a transformation that will have to happen with the world
Mm-hmm.
itself. And I don't
Yeah.
100% know what all of that means yet. And I feel like I'm just
And
babbling at this
but like
point.
I feel like that's pretty much on point. But what I'm also finding that I'm really confused and fascinated by at the same time is so the Discord's been translating a bunch of Nakadic And one of the big things that they translated was on the door of the temple.
Yeah, and
It
how
said,
it's Yuggoth or
yeah, Yog-Sothoth.
Yoggoth.
Yog-Sothoth is knows the gate, and the key. Yog-Sothoth is the guardian of the gate. Something like that. It's a quote, a direct quote from the Dunwich Horror, and which is really interesting to me because that opens, and I didn't want to go. There's not enough time to go into all of the Yog-Sothoth lore because that's just a whole lot. But one thing that I find interesting about John specifically using that, and I don't think it was just a throwaway thing necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but it makes me wonder because Yog-Sothoth in the Dunwich Horror essentially impregnates a human female, and she gives birth to a half human, half cosmic entity who is supposed to assist Yog-Sothoth in bringing all of the outer gods and the greater old ones who used to rule the earth but no longer do and are trapped outside back in.
Oh, okay. This
And
why does this remind me of Ghostbusters? I don't
I
know.
mean, John's actually mentioned Ghostbusters.
Okay, okay.
He said that Ghostbusters 2 was like a
I'm literally
huge
like
influence.
I'm literally having Ghostbuster 2 vibes, like the goo and like the idea
Literally.
of like the child being born and then the like
Mm-hmm.
elder god that's trapped in the painting and like ah yeah.
It's definitely a rabbit hole, but that just could like go on forever. But I think it's interesting that the prospect, because we know that Alora is a goddess,
Hmm.
and I've been
When
trying to figure out.
okay, so I've been thinking a lot about this. So
Mm,
character development is always based on sort of a truth that you believe to be true, but has never actually been true. And the only question that I think is still out there for Alora that was pre first season is why was our good friend Queen Bavmorda actually afraid of a baby? And I actually don't have a good answer for that, except that because if she just dies, it's like that's future Bavmorda's problem, or that's
mm,
future worm problem, right? But if
yeah.
she is able to bring about some sort of unique and different balance to the world, then it creates
Mhm.
a third path, or
Yeah.
something, or there's something that she is meant to do that would help
Mhm.
I guess sort of I don't know, transform the the world into a different path.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that makes me wonder about Grayden because clearly he's connected to a cosmic entity in that they have the same name. And we know he
Yeah.
has magic, and he's had problems with possession multiple times in his life. Um, it just
Mhm.
feels like it's just he's got to be something more than just a human with magic,
Mhm.
and that's what makes me think is interesting about Yog-Sothoth because that's an instance of a character being literally half cosmic entity. And is it possible? And what's interesting is because uh, the character's the character's mother, her father summoned him to impregnate her because he was a sorcerer. And it makes me wonder, like, did King Haster summon some being for whatever reason to give him a perfect heir or something, or what? So many possibilities, but I think that uh, it would be interesting that now that the Fae of the Grove seem to be gone or hidden,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
and the
yeah.
only godlike entity we have is the worm, but the
And
worm
and
represents
Alora,
not
right?
disconnected.
Yeah.
Well, the worm seems to have been there before Laura was even
Right.
born, and that's why the Beth Morda and everyone was following him. So like the Fae of the Grove are all gone, and the worm, which represents not a complete life and death cycle, but
Right.
just like a
Just
everything ending
just
sort of
just
thing.
the end. Yeah, 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 yeah.
And then Alora, the embodiment of all life, shows up, and then Grayden at some point, the embodiment of all potential darkness, also shows up. And this is another thing that I find potentially kind of mind blowing, is because in the first story that Yog-Sothoth is ever mentioned in, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, he's used in an incantation formulae that involves the ascending and descending lunar nodes, the dragon's head and the dragon's tail, and often they're associated with it's similar to like an Ouroboros, like, but an entirely full one, like a
Yeah.
that is. And I went on a whole thread that
Like
like goes into like
that
the
is interconnected, or it's swallowing its own tail.
yeah, yeah, like because the tail is often associated with light, because that is directly associated to um, in Indian mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to remember their names. I can't remember the head. I can't remember the name of the head of the dragon, but the tail of the dragon is called Ketu, and Ketu, that word means light. And
Okay.
so
So, John, what are you doing?
and
What are you doing to us? John, what are you doing to us?
yeah, I don't know, because then also Yog-Sothoth is like literally time and space itself.
Yeah.
Like
And
is a,
like
he's a
he is the gateway, right? Like
yeah,
he
like
yeah.
it, and
Okay.
that's where I'm like, how deep is he going? When he says it goes deep, how deep does he really mean?
Uh,
Oh,
yeah.
it's just
I remember talking with my good friend Ty Black about Cthulhu Mythos, and I'm like, I have to say, of the things that John Kasdan could have chosen to actually give me that fear reaction of my own subconscious. This was the only thing. Like, I've done enough digging out my garbage and like looking at it and be like, yeah, that's garbage, that I'm not as affected as I maybe was many, many years ago. But Cthulhu Mythos is just so weird. And I
it's
like
very weird.
I like it literally creates this like mind bending, but also like when you stare long enough you're like, hey, this makes sense, and then as soon as it starts making sense you're like, am I now the crazy one? Like, yeah. And
Literally.
like, I love it. I who thought we'd be here? We're just like, Paul Rudd. I'm like eating my
And
chicken wings. I'm like, I didn't think I'd be here.
I had a moment yesterday when I was rereading that specific story, and it didn't occur to me the first time I read it until this time, that the character, when he recites the formulae, he always feels off unless he completes it. There's something wrong unless he completes with uh, the dragon's tail. And then at the very end of it, defeating the antagonist of the story, he uses the dragon's tail. And so like the dragon's head resurrects this character, and then the dragon's tail uh, puts they become dust again, essentially. And so it's like a complementing thing that needs to go together in order for there to be balance. And like saying both of them together is soothing to the character. And I don't know. It just seems to me kind of like, okay, so like
I
a
mean,
death and rebirth of deities,
yeah.
and that bringing about balance to Anduin. So like whatever happened in the Grove that split the Fae
Yeah.
and is associated with the worm, that's in balance. And now Laura and Grayden show up, and they complement each other, but are sort of embodying
Opposites.
opposites.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying that, I mean,
Well, that gives us enough to talk about until they give us our season 2. So,
Definitely.
and that was just a sliver. Like that's
Oh yeah.
the problem with this, is that there's so much to dig into, to understand. And Hannah, like there's so much. Thank
Oh,
you so much for reading so much over the last 2 months, and like
oh,
digging into it and doing your amazing tweet threads. And I'm sure there's another topic we're going to want to talk about on What the Force
definitely.
and how we think about Willow.
Oh, this was so much fun. Thank you. Oh,
Well, thank you for coming on the show, and cheers.